from within our country. The weaponization of law enforcement is the greatest threat. Our biggest threat to democracy is stupid people.
Might actually be right with that last one.
That's our friends of The Daily Show kicking us off this morning. Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It is Friday, July 24th. I'm Jonathan Lemire. Thank you so much for being with us. We've got a great group this morning. No stupid people here. Let's get right to it. MSNOW National Affairs analyst John Heilman's here. He is partner and chief political columnist at Puck, columnist and associate editor at The Washington Post, David Ignatius, managing editor at The Bulwark, Sam Stein, and MSNOW senior Capitol Hill reporter and host of Way Too Early, Ali Vitale here as well. A great group. Thank you again. And we have actually a very, very busy morning this morning, so we're going to get started right away, beginning with the Middle East. The United States and Iran exchanged fire for the 13th straight night, with both sides showing no signs of slowing down. Axios is reporting that President Trump told that outlet yesterday that he's seriously considering restarting major combat operations in Iran, including strikes that would be bigger, he says, than the ones carried out during Operation Epic Fury. Trump said this: "I am considering a massive attack, bigger than ever before. I am close to making a decision. We're all set for it." Trump, however, acknowledged that such a decision would have real consequences and stressed that he has not made a final determination yet. That's according to Axios. And of course, we know he has talked big before and not followed through. We shall see. So as the stalemate continues, the New York Times reports that Iran rejected a U.S. ceasefire proposal that was presented to them by the Iraqi prime minister, who was in Washington earlier this week. Iranian officials tell the Times that it was the only offer on the table and that their government was not interested in a temporary deal that left the question of control over the Strait of Hormuz unresolved. That key waterway, of course, remains at the center of the conflict. Trump yesterday claimed that any damage to ships will be paid for with frozen Iranian funds. Iran's foreign minister responded that such a move would set an incendiary precedent. So, David Ignatius, let's start here. The president suggests we could be on the precipice of a major resumption of hostilities. As I noted, he has done that before without following through. But there certainly does seem to be a growing frustration out of Washington about where things stand. We are now, 10 days plus, 13 days of strikes. The Strait of Hormuz is very much not open and free and fair for all, and negotiations seem to be going nowhere. What's the latest you heard about what could be next?
So, Jonathan, I hear that he feels trapped in the situation. He has wanted to get out of this war. He, in effect, is making the same, I fear, misjudgment that he made at the beginning, which is to think that hitting targets harder in Iran will lead the Iranian regime to capitulate, that they're so weak that surely they can be made to submit to American pressure militarily. It didn't happen at the beginning of the war when it started in February 28. It doesn't seem to be happening in this latest round when the president returned to combat, so he keeps dialing up the level of U.S. attacks, and there's no sign the Iranians are prepared to capitulate. They think that if they push back hard, and they've been doing that, actually killing American soldiers by firing on bases in Jordan in particular, that they believe that is going to force the U.S. to make further concessions. So it's a terrible situation for President Trump. I've watched presidents face similar situations with the Vietnam War, with Iraq and Afghanistan. In the end, with those wars, American troops ended up basically deciding to pull out. It simply wasn't achievable. President Trump isn't at that point yet, but he faces a series of terrible decisions that could make this war much more costly.
Yeah, I wrote earlier this week about that exact bind that he is in. Some in his party urging him to cut and run right now to try to save the GOP's chances in the midterms. Others saying no, escalate despite what could be a significant cost, both in terms of politically, but also maybe in American lives. And this conflict is hot. In fact, the AP reports this morning that one of their journalists in Iraq heard several explosions near a U.S. base there. Now, it doesn't know what caused the explosions. We, of course, will continue to monitor this, but there were more strikes last night in the region. We will keep you posted. Meanwhile, the New York Times is pointing out that the number of U.S. troop deaths in the Iran war suddenly appeared lower on the Pentagon website this week, dropping from 18 that was listed on Wednesday down to 14 listed yesterday. 3 military officials tell the paper that one reason behind the change was the Trump administration decided to remove the 4 service members killed this past weekend from the list, took them off it, because their deaths occurred after President Trump declared a ceasefire in the war in April. Now, the acting press secretary for the Pentagon, however, attributed the change to temporary data disruptions on the website that he suggested would be quickly fixed. But Sam Stein, I mean, this wouldn't be the first time that the government, that the Trump administration has tried to doctor things to make the president look better. It is a nonsensical argument that these 4 lives would matter less because they happened after a ceasefire was declared, when obviously the ceasefire is over. There are major strikes happening in the region now for well more than a week. To me, this was particularly outrageous and disgraceful.
Well, to me, too. It's both not shocking that the Trump administration would do this, and it's shocking that it happened. What is the actual goal of doing something like this? Is it to try to limit your political exposure for the war? Is it try to cover up the actual costs of the engagement that you launched with Iran? Or is the American public somehow going to say, okay, we can stomach this more because it's not 18, it's 14? It's despicable, honestly. It's failing to own the consequences of their actions, or at least trying to avoid the consequences of their actions. And honestly, it's insulting to the people who sacrificed, to say, hey, this was not actually a war casualty. It was, a casualty of what's the word he uses, skirmish? I found this to be among the more offensive moves that the administration has made politically, but it obviously reflects a larger thinking that they have internally, which is that this is politically problematic and they need to sort of put their fingers on the ledger here. And Trump is open about this all the time. The other day, he put out some post on Truth Social where he was comparing the casualty counts and the costs of different wars, Vietnam, Iraq, and Iran, as if, we're lucky that we've only had 18 sacrifices here. It's how he views this conflict, not necessarily through the human sacrifice, but the political cost that he has to incur. And, you can only imagine the other stuff they are covering up, because if they're willing to cover up the deaths of 4 U.S. service members, what do we know about the actual cost of the war? What do we know about our munitions level? It raises a whole host of other questions. And frankly, I feel very sorry for the families of these 4 people who we're putting up here, that they have to now be dragged through this political debate about whether their sacrifice counts as a war casualty or not.
Yeah, the callousness here is off the charts, but perhaps not surprising. I agree with you, Sam. Remember, President Trump in his first term called those who were reportedly killed in combat suckers and losers for that sacrifice, John Heilman. But it's beyond just the lack of any humanity. It's also, to a larger point, we can't trust what the U.S. government, the Pentagon, the White House is saying about this war. We haven't gotten a Pentagon briefing since early May. We've been reporting in the Washington Post, New York Times, other places. They've really downplayed the number of service members who have been injured in these attacks. The American people simply don't know what's going on.
I mean, with respect to the war, it's particularly egregious. Jonathan, we were talking about this on the show maybe earlier this week, where, throughout the course of the 5 months almost now that the conflict's been going on, you've seen this game playing with numbers. And so the overstatement of the success of our strikes in the early phases of the war by Pete Hegseth, how much did we control the skies? How much had we taken out of Iran's ballistic missile capacity? And then the understatement of how much damage Iran had done, again, to direct U.S. assets and to assets of allies in the region, where we found that those have all been understated. And, the great symbolism here is the fact that Pete Hegseth has, basically totally has banned the former Pentagon press corps from the Pentagon Pentagon briefing room, and it's now stocked with some of the most ludicrous examples of non-news operations and propaganda outfits that you can imagine. The government throughout, in a thoroughgoing way, it's the least reliable in terms of the statistic it puts out and the claims that it makes of any government in our lifetime. And it's particularly acute in this crucial agency right now at a time of war. And I think, the watchword now with this group, and it's not overstating to say, and I think I cited this the other day, that Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan had been saying that, we've gotten to a place where if you cover this administration, your presumption has to be they are lying, and you are open to being proven otherwise. But in the past, we basically sort of thought, well, we give you the presumption of you're telling the truth, and we try to poke holes, see if we can find places where you're lying. It's the 180 degrees out now, and that is a really depressing state of affairs.
No, completely agree. Completely depressing. And yes, there certainly is a political cost of this war, and we see American people don't like it in part because it's never been explained to them why we're doing it in the first place. And we're seeing Congress, even some normal Trump allies, growing restless too. In fact, the House is once again telling the White House to either end the war in Iran or come to Congress for approval to keep fighting. Lawmakers passed the non-binding resolution with 4 Republicans joining Democrats in a bipartisan rebuke of President Trump's handling of this conflict. One Republican, Congressman Tom Barrett of Michigan, defended his vote, saying, "My position hasn't changed. Only Congress has the authority to authorize military action in Iran. I remain ready to work with anyone to eliminate hostile threats to our nation without getting us into another endless war." Now, a similar effort failed in the Senate, and the debate is expected to continue when Congress returns in September. Trump ignored similar rebukes last month when both chambers passed a war powers resolution for the first time since the conflict began in late February. And Allie, yes, Congress about to head out to recess for a long time. Let's talk about this, though. It's symbolic mostly, but still important. And even earlier this week, House Speaker Mike Johnson, who, of course, would never dream of actually defying the White House, but even he said in a press conference that it was perhaps time to wrap this war up. There are big geopolitical, geostrategic concerns here, but for those in the GOP who are looking to get reelected this November, they understand this war and the accompanying rising prices is a real anchor around their candidacy.
They do understand that, and yet I think there are those who are willing to speak in some tepid ways against the actions of the administration, whether you see the speaker's recent comments about needing to wrap up the conflict as that could be one example. But there are rarer instances of lawmakers on the Republican side willing to vote against the interests of this president, still giving him a really long leash, despite the fact that we're talking about the public perception and the ways that the public needs to be skeptical, and journalists certainly need to be highly skeptical of everything that this administration says. There is a real view on Capitol Hill that there has not been transparency, even with Republicans, about what's going on when it comes to being briefed on these conflicts. That was a feeling that was prevalent around Venezuela in the early part of the year. It's a feeling that has remained certainly around the ongoing Iran conflict. You ask members, certainly on the Democratic side, the last time they were briefed in the aftermath of American troops being killed on the ground, and they'll tell you they don't even think that their requests for briefings are going to be answered in timely fashion. But on the Republican side, too, you have seen Republican members quietly complain about the lack of information and forthcomingness out of this Pentagon. And that's certainly something that, as we chart the path into September, it'll be a more lame duck congressional period. Is this a moment where members start voting in tandem with the concerns that they are airing privately? Because I'll tell you, and I know that many of us have heard the same things from Republican strategists, they really do see the political cost of the Iran war as the highest bill that they have yet to pay. And this is something where I think many of them are hoping that this conflict does wrap up, to borrow the speaker's terms. But I think that they also know that it is an intractable conflict. No one gets into it thinking it's going to be a long-term thing. And yet here we are heading into month 6, and the president is keeping hope that he could actively revive the conflict. That's something that Republican strategists are really worried about going into the midterms. And so we're right to focus on all of the various costs, the human costs chief among them. But the politics has always ridden right alongside with this war.
Yeah, we've gone through a number of ways already this morning in terms of how this conflict is going poorly for the White House, is going poorly for the United States and its allies. Well, here's a way where it's getting even worse, as Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi rebels are now threatening to block Saudi-linked shipping through the Red Sea, which is one of the world's busiest trade routes. The Houthis say they attacked 2 Saudi oil tankers there, with Saudi authorities confirming a fire on one vessel but reporting no casualties. This latest escalation is fueling fears of another hit to global energy markets, with oil briefly topping $100 per barrel as traders worry that further disruptions could choke off key supply routes. President Trump responded on Truth Social, warning that if the Houthis attack ships again, the United States will hold Iran responsible and inflict, in his words, major military punishment on both Iran and their proxy group. Trump called Houthis a proxy of Iran and said that they had acted very responsibly until this latest attack, urging the group not to escalate the conflict. The U.S., of course, hit the Houthis a year ago. They'd largely been on the sidelines, David Ignatius, of this conflict until it appears right now. And this is one of those moments that could have a negative impact in both of the spheres we're talking about. Politically, yes, because it could lead to soaring energy prices, and that would be devastating for the party in power, the Republicans. But also geopolitically, geostrategically, they're in the region where it would be yet another way for Iran to enhance its standing, and the Gulf allies who have sort of gone along for the most part with this war with the United States, again, suffering the consequences.
So Trump administration fought a war against the Houthis last year. They used significant military power to try to suppress Houthi firing on targets in the UAE, in the Gulf, and that campaign was not entirely successful, as we can see that the Houthis were deterred for a time, but here they are back again. Their ability to cut off another avenue for exporting Saudi and Gulf crude through the Red Sea tightens this economic problem even more. We're finally seeing energy markets, after slumbering for a while, oil prices were down around $85, back up above $100. And that's a sign that financial traders have given up, seem to be giving up their expectation that somehow Trump would find a way out of this. That confidence seems now to be disappearing from the markets. If the United States is in a two-front war against an Iran that is very hard to suppress, despite claims every other day from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth that they've been degraded, and we're in a second conflict against another resilient ally that's closing another key waterway, the United States really is pinned down in the Middle East. And it's striking that we have, at this point, no international support from other countries that depend on commerce through these straits, through the Strait of Hormuz, through the Strait of Bab al-Mandab that the Houthis control. You'd think the Europeans would be finding ways to help the United States. They aren't. They want to stay away. And that's, I think, another key problem for the administration. It just doesn't have enough friends and supporters on this campaign.
And that's by its own doing. This is a war of choice, and they went in alone after alienating so many of their key allies. And right now, the United States is losing this war, and it seems to be getting worse. We're going to have much more on the Middle East later in the show. We're going to sneak in a quick break. Everyone's going to stay put. Ahead here on Morning Joe, after issuing subpoenas to 3 New York Times reporters, the Department of Justice is suddenly back. The Department of Justice has withdrawn the subpoenas it issued to 3 New York Times reporters who detailed security concerns about the new Air Force One that was gifted to President Trump by the Qatari royal family. The reversal came after a judge pressed DOJ lawyers for nearly an hour yesterday, questioning prosecutors' decisions to issue the subpoenas before pursuing other investigative steps. The DOJ issued those subpoenas, which sought phone records and grand jury testimonies after the Times reported earlier this month that that new plane lacks the critical defensive countermeasures that the previous plane, the actual Air Force One, had. Following the reporting, Trump swapped out the new plane for that original jet for his flight from the NATO summit to the United Kingdom, and then almost immediately ordered FBI Director Kash Patel to investigate the leak. Patel summoned to the White House. Subpoenas came the next day. The decision comes after the Times moved to overturn the subpoenas, arguing they, quote, represent a brazen effort to intimidate the press and violate basic First Amendment protections for news gathering activity. So, John Heilemann, certainly good news that these subpoenas have been tossed aside. We'll see what happens next.